The leather satchel on the table was worth more than the chair he was sitting on. It was a deep, polished oxblood, and its silver clasps were silent and precise. The man who owned it, a Mr. Davies from the Internal Revenue Service, had placed it there with a practiced reverence, as if it were an extension of his own authority. He had just finished his final offer, a figure that was still ruinous but presented as a monumental concession. He leaned back, the fabric of his suit jacket making a faint, expensive sound against the faux leather of the government-issued chair. He smiled, a patient, professional expression that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who had already won and was simply completing the formalities. He had laid out the numbers, the penalties, the interest accrued over 4 decades. The final amount was $186,411.73. He was a man who believed in the precision of cents. His gaze rested on the woman sitting opposite him, Eleanor Vance, a widow of 2 years, whose hands were folded so tightly in her lap they had lost their colour. Beside her sat her son. The man had not spoken for the last 45 minutes. His name was Mark. He wore a flannel shirt that was clean but faded at the elbows, and his boots, though wiped down, still held the fine dust of the fields he worked. He looked at Mr. Davies, then at the file folder in front of him, and then back at Mr. Davies. The silence stretched. It was a tactical silence, employed by Davies to let the weight of the number settle, to let it crush whatever small hope remained. Eleanor shifted, a small bird-like movement of unease. Davies began to speak again, his voice soft, almost sympathetic. "It's the best we can do, Mrs. Vance, a structured payment plan. We can avoid a lien on the property. We can avoid further action." He was preparing to close his satchel. The meeting was, for all intents and purposes, over. Then the son spoke. His voice was low, not confrontational, simply a statement of fact that fell into the sterile air of the small conference room. "No, that's not correct." Mr. Davies paused, his hand hovering over the silver clasp. He tilted his head slightly, an expression of mild curiosity, the kind one might show a child who had misunderstood a simple instruction. "I'm sorry?" The man, Mark, did not raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He simply sat there, a picture of stillness against his mother's quiet tremor. He looked less like a man in a tax negotiation and more like a man waiting for a bus. His presence was unassuming, easily dismissed. He had said almost nothing since they'd arrived, offering only his name and his relationship to Eleanor. Davies had directed all his arguments, all his polished reasoning, to the widow. The son was just a piece of familial scenery. The stakes were clear, brutal in their simplicity. The farm had been in the Vance family for 3 generations. It wasn't a sprawling agricultural enterprise. It was 120 acres of hayfields and timber, with a stone-walled farmhouse built in 1928. It was everything. The tax liability, Davies had explained, stemmed from an inheritance, a gift of land from Eleanor's father to her husband David back in the 70s, a transfer that, according to their records, had never been properly taxed. 4 decades of compounding interest and penalties had turned a minor oversight into a financial cataclysm. The farm would have to be sold. There was no other way to satisfy a debt of that size. That was the reality Davies had so carefully constructed. He was the architect of this unavoidable conclusion. He ran the numbers. He held the authority. The man across from him held nothing but a cheap manila folder. Mark repeated himself, his tone unchanged. "The assessment is incorrect. The tax was paid." He said it not as an argument, but as one might state the time of day. Davies finally let a flicker of impatience show. He closed his satchel with a soft, definitive click. "Sir, we have been over this. Our records are exhaustive. There is no filing for a gift tax. No record of payment for the parcel in question for the tax year 1977. If you have documentation to the contrary, you would have presented it weeks ago. He gestured vaguely at the thick file on his side of the table, a testament to the weight of the institution he represented. The son, this quiet farmer, finally moved. He reached down and opened his simple folder. The room, which had felt charged with the energy of institutional power, suddenly went very still. To understand what was in the folder, you have to go back 5 weeks, back to the first letter that had arrived, thick and cream-coloured, with the stark block letter return address of the Department of the Treasury. Mark had found his mother at the kitchen table staring at it, her morning coffee untouched.
The numbers on the page seemed unreal, a misprint from another world. His first instinct was anger, a hot flash of injustice. But that passed quickly, replaced by something colder and more practical. His father, David Vance, had been a man of quiet, almost severe order. He was a mechanic and a farmer, a man whose hands were calloused and stained with grease, but whose mind was a ledger of incredible precision. He kept records, not just of the farm's earnings, but of everything. Warranties for kitchen appliances bought in 1985, receipts for new tires on a truck he'd sold a decade ago, manuals for tools he no longer owned. His workshop wasn't cluttered. It was a library of physical objects, each with its place. After he died, Mark and his mother had gone through his things, but mostly they had preserved his spaces. The workshop, the small office off the back porch. They were monuments to a man they still missed deeply. The search began there, in the office.
Mark spent 3 days going through the old metal filing cabinet. He pulled out every folder, read every label written in his father's neat, blocky handwriting. Fuel costs, 1980 to 1985. Cattle sales, 1992. Vet bills. There was nothing about the land transfer. He moved to the boxes in the attic, stacked under the eaves. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the bare bulb. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and cedar. He opened box after box, old photographs, his own report cards, letters from his grandparents. It was a slow, painstaking archaeology of a family's life. He felt less like he was searching for a document and more like he was having a final, silent conversation with his father. He saw the evidence of his father's life, his diligence, his quiet consistency. A man like that, he thought, doesn't forget to pay a tax.
A man who saves the receipt for a $5 bag of seed corn from 1982 does not misplace a tax filing that secures the future of his family's land. The thought was not a hope, it was a conviction. He worked for a week, evenings and weekends, sifting through the past. His mother would bring him coffee, her face etched with a silent, weary anxiety. She trusted her son, but she feared the institution that had sent the letter. It felt too big to fight, too faceless to reason with. The breakthrough, when it came, was not dramatic. It was as quiet as everything else about his father. On the 9th day of searching, in the last box from the attic, he found a small cardboard shoebox. It was labeled simply, "Personal." Inside, beneath his father's birth certificate and his honorable discharge papers from the Army, was his father's first wallet. It was cheap, cracked brown leather, the kind a young man might buy for himself. Tucked into a faded plastic sleeve where a photograph might go, Mark found a single folded piece of paper. It was a receipt. Carbon copy, the ink a faint purple, the paper thin as a moth's wing. At the top it said, "Internal Revenue Service," and at the bottom, a stamp, "Paid." February 11th, 1977. The amount was $52. David Vance had lived by a simple code. Do the job right the first time and keep the proof. He had learned this from his own father, who had nearly lost the farm during the Depression over a disputed property line, a dispute settled only by a hand-drawn map his grandfather had the foresight to get notarized. That story had been passed down not as a colourful family anecdote, but as a foundational lesson. Paper, David used to say, is patient. Paper remembers. He was a man who understood that institutions have no memory, only records, and records could be lost. He had received the 12-acre parcel from his father-in-law in late 1976. It wasn't a gift of sentiment, it was a practical matter. The parcel connected the main farm to the county road, granting them crucial access for moving equipment and timber. Without it, they were dependent on a crumbling access road that washed out every spring. The gift was freedom. It was security. David, then a young man of 28, had gone to the county seat himself. He'd spoken to the tax assessor, filled out the forms, and asked what was owed. The gift tax at the time was calculated differently, based on the assessed value of the land for agricultural use, which was minimal. The liability was small, $52. He paid it in cash at the local IRS field office, a cramped room above the post office that had closed down 30 years ago. He got a receipt, and the clerk, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who knew his family, had stamped it with a heavy, satisfying thud. He'd folded that receipt and put it in his wallet. For years it stayed there. Eventually he got a new wallet, and the old one, with its important cargo, was retired to the shoebox. He never spoke of it. Why would he? The job was done. The proof was kept. It was a closed loop, a finished task. For Mark, this small piece of paper was more than just a receipt. It was a distillation of his father's entire character. It was the physical proof of his diligence, his foresight, his quiet integrity. The $186,000 demand from the IRS wasn't just a threat to his mother's home. It was an assault on his father's memory. It suggested a carelessness, an oversight, that was fundamentally alien to the man David Vance had been. Mark's fight wasn't about the money. It was about setting a crooked thing straight. It was about honoring the quiet, methodical man who had taught him how to fix an engine, how to read the sky for rain, and how to keep your records in order. He made a high-quality scan of the receipt, then a few photocopies. He placed the original in a protective plastic sleeve. Then he went to the university library 2 towns over and spent an entire Saturday in the archives looking at microfiche of the 1977 United States Tax Code. He found the section on gift taxes on Form 4797, and he made copies of those pages too. He was not a lawyer. He was a farmer, but he knew how to do his research. He was, in this way, very much his father's son. Back in the conference room, the air was tight with unspoken challenge. Mr. Davies watched as Mark slid the plastic-sleeved document across the table. It came to a stop directly in front of him. Davies did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it, then at Mark, his professional composure hardening into a mask of skepticism. "What is this?" Mark answered, his voice steady. "A receipt for the payment of the gift tax on the parcel in question, dated February 11th, 1977, for $52. Davies finally picked it up, holding it by the edges as if it were contaminated.
He squinted at the faint purple text. A faint, dismissive smile played on his lips. "Mr. Vance, this is a 40-year-old piece of paper. It's a carbon copy. It could be anything. It proves nothing. Our records, our official, digitized and cross-referenced records, show no such payment." Mark did not react. He had expected this. He had planned for it. He let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke again. The payment was made in cash at the Ridgefield field office, which was closed in 1989. The filing was made on a Form 4797, Supplemental Schedule of Gains and Losses. At the time, for agricultural land transfers between family members under a certain value, this was the correct procedure. The records from that office were likely never digitized. They were probably archived as paper or microfiche, if they weren't lost entirely during the office closure. Davies put the receipt down. He tented his fingers. He was shifting from dismissal to procedural argument. His tone was condescending, pedagogical. Even if, for the sake of argument, this document is authentic, The amount is $52. The liability, with 4 decades of interest and penalties for what we have assessed as a non-filing, is over $186,000. A $52 payment, even if it were made, wouldn't cover the penalties for an improperly filed return. You are misunderstanding the nature of the issue. The issue isn't the tax amount, it's the failure to file which triggers these subsequent actions. His confidence was returning. He was on familiar ground now, the unassailable logic of bureaucratic procedure. Mark was ready for this too. He reached into his folder and pulled out the photocopied pages from the 1977 tax code. He placed them on the table next to the receipt. No, the failure was not on our end.
According to the 1977 tax code, Section 10, Paragraph B, a properly filed Form 4797 with proof of payment constituted a satisfaction of the tax obligation. There was no failure to file. The filing was complete on February 11, 1977. Therefore, no penalties or interest can be legally accrued. The debt is zero. Mr. Davies stared at the photocopied pages. He picked one up. The text was dense, filled with the arcane language of the tax code. He was a field agent, an enforcer. He was not a historian of tax law. His expertise was in current regulations, in the powerful software that tracked and calculated and flagged. He was an agent of the digital present, and this quiet man was confronting him with the analog past. He tried a third angle, this time an appeal to common sense, the argument of a reasonable man against an absurdity. Mr. Vance, let's be realistic. You are asking the United States government to reverse a $186,000 tax assessment based on a faded receipt and a copy of a law that hasn't been relevant for decades. You have to see how that looks from our perspective. The system doesn't work that way. There are statutes of limitations. There are procedures. This is simply not possible. He spread his hands, a gesture of finality. This was the end of the line. Mark watched him. He saw the confidence wavering, the first hairline cracks appearing in the smooth facade of institutional certainty. He had one more thing. He had held it back. From the same folder, he produced the final document. It was a printout from the county clerk's website. It's a copy of the deed transfer for the parcel. It was recorded on February 15th, 1977, 4 days after the tax was paid. He pointed to a small stamp in the corner of the digital image. You'll notice the clerk's stamp there. Standard procedure at the time in our county was that a deed transfer could not be officially recorded until proof of tax payment was presented to the clerk. The receipt was the proof. The recorded deed is the proof of the proof. The system, he said, his voice still quiet but now edged with the hardness of irrefutable fact, did work that way. It worked exactly that way. Davies stared at the printout. The chain of logic was complete. It was elegant in its simplicity. The receipt, the law, the deed. It was a closed loop, just as David Vance had intended it to be all those years ago. The room was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. The weight had shifted. The air of inevitability had evaporated, replaced by something new, uncertainty. And for Mr. Davies, it was a deeply unfamiliar feeling. He looked from the papers to Mark, and for the first time, he seemed to see him not as an obstacle, but as an adversary. A quiet, patient, and thoroughly prepared adversary.
The moment of verification was profoundly anticlimactic. Mr. Davies, his face a tight mask of professional control, announced that he would need to make a call. He did not ask for permission. He stood, walked to the corner of the room, and dialed a number on his cell phone. He turned his back to Mark and Eleanor, a small gesture of privacy that felt more like a retreat. His voice was low, a series of clipped formal phrases. Case file 774-B. Vance, Eleanor. disputing a 1977 liability. There were long pauses. Mark could hear the faint, tinny sound of a voice on the other end. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the table beside his father's papers. Eleanor looked at him, a question in her eyes. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Now we wait," he had told her the night before, "however long it takes." The wait stretched into minutes, 10, 15. The only sound in the room was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the low murmur of Davies's conversation. He was being transferred. He was being put on hold. Mark could chart the man's growing frustration by the subtle stiffening of his shoulders, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. This was the part of the process Mark had counted on, the difficulty, the inconvenience. He knew the IRS was a vast, sprawling machine. Finding a single physical record from a defunct field office from 40 years ago would be like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach. But he also knew that the machine, for all its size, was bound by its own rules. If a record existed, they were obligated to find it. Finally, Davies fell silent. He was listening. He stood motionless for what felt like a full minute. Then he spoke one word. "Confirm." Another pause. "Thank you." He ended the call. He did not turn around immediately. He stood facing the corner for a few seconds as if gathering himself. When he did turn, his expression was different. The professional mask was gone, replaced by a flat, neutral look. The certainty, the condescension, the faint air of pity. It had all been wiped away. He walked back to the table and sat down. His movements were stiff, precise. "There was a record," he said. His voice was devoid of any inflection. "The National Archives in Missouri. A microfiche copy of the Ridgefield office's daily transaction log for February 1977. It shows a cash payment of $52 from David Vance. The file will be updated. The assessment will be corrected." He said the words as if reading a weather report. He did not look at Mark. He did not look at Eleanor. He looked at a fixed point on the wall just above their heads. The great, unassailable institution had been forced to look into its own dusty, forgotten attic, and it had found the truth right where David Vance had left it. The negotiation, when it came, was not about money. It was about dignity. Mr. Davies, having delivered the news of his own defeat, immediately shifted into damage control. He opened his expensive satchel and removed a fresh set of forms. His voice regained some of its smooth, professional tone. "Very well, it appears there was a clerical error in the original digitization process. These things can happen with older records. What I can do is expedite the zeroing out of the balance. We'll just need you to sign a standard closure agreement. It stipulates that the matter is resolved and no further action will be taken by either party." He slid a form across the table. It was 3 pages of dense legal text. A non-disclosure agreement was buried in the 3rd paragraph. Mark did not pick it up. He looked at the man who had, an hour ago, been preparing to take his mother's home. The offer to expedite was presented as a courtesy, a favour. It was an attempt to reframe the encounter, to cast himself as a helpful facilitator rather than a defeated functionary. It was an attempt to retain the last shred of institutional power. Mark looked at his mother. Her hands were still folded in her lap, but the tension was gone. A quiet calm had settled over her. For the first time that day, she looked directly at Mr. Davies. "Tell him no," she said. Her voice was soft but clear as a bell. It was the first time she had spoken directly to the agent. Mark turned his attention back to Davies. "No," he said, "we won't be signing anything." Mr. Davies blinked. "But this will close the file. It resolves the matter." "The matter is already resolved," Mark said. "The tax was paid in 1977. There is no file to close. There is only a mistake to correct. We don't need it expedited, we need it done right. We require a formal letter of correction from the Department of the Treasury sent to my mother's address, stating that the assessment was made in error and the balance owed is 0. That is all. The demand was simple, absolute, and non-negotiable.
He was not asking for an apology. He was not asking for damages.
He was asking only for the truth to be put on paper, officially and unequivocally. He was asking the institution to create a new record, one that would overwrite the false one that would honour his father's old one. Davies seemed for a moment at a loss for words. The script he normally followed had run out of pages. He was faced with a quiet, immovable object. He looked at the farmer and the farmer's mother, and he saw that there was no leverage left to apply. There were no threats to make, no offers to extend. The power dynamic in the room had been completely and quietly inverted. "You will have your letter," he said finally. His voice was flat. The words were a surrender. The end was quiet. There was no handshake, no parting words beyond the necessary procedural ones. Mr. Davies gathered his papers, his movements now stripped of their earlier confidence.
He placed the forms, the file, and the useless closure agreements back into his oxblood satchel. The silver clasps clicked shut with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent room. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the door without a backward glance. He did not say goodbye. The door closed behind him, and the latch engaged with a soft click. Mark and his mother were alone. For a moment, neither of them moved. The room felt vast and empty. The only things left on the table were Mark's simple manila folder and the documents spread beside it. The receipt in its plastic sleeve, the copies of the old tax code, the printout of the deed. A small collection of paper that had outweighed the entire force of a government agency. Mark slowly began to gather the documents. He picked up the receipt first, handling it with a gentle reverence.
He looked at the faded purple ink, the firm, decisive stamp. Paid. A single word that had held its truth for 44 years, waiting patiently in the dark. He slid it out of its protective sleeve and opened the old, cracked leather wallet he had taken from his father's shoebox. It was the wallet he had been carrying for the past 5 weeks. He tucked the receipt back into the plastic window where it had sat for so long. He folded the wallet and put it in the inside pocket of his coat. It was a small private ritual, a closing of the circle. He then stacked the other papers neatly and placed them back in the manila folder. He stood up and pushed his chair in, the legs scraping softly against the linoleum floor. His mother watched him, her eyes shining. She did not speak. She did not need to. He walked around the table to her, and she stood to meet him. She placed a hand on his arm, a grip surprisingly firm. The touch conveyed everything that words could not, the relief, the gratitude, the deep, abiding pride. He put his hand over hers. "It's done," he said. "Let's go home." They walked out of the sterile conference room, leaving nothing behind but an empty table and the faint indentation of a leather satchel in the dust. There was no celebration. There was no triumph. There was only the quiet, steady restoration of what was right. The drive back to the farm was silent. Mark drove the old pickup, the one that had been his father's. The afternoon sun slanted across the hayfields, turning the dry grass to gold. The familiar landmarks passed by the window, the old oak tree struck by lightning, the neighbour's barn with the faded chewing tobacco ad, the turn-off onto the gravel road that led to home. When they pulled into the driveway, Eleanor got out and walked directly to her garden. The late-season roses were still in bloom, their petals a deep, defiant red against the coming autumn.
Mark watched her for a moment before getting out of the truck. He walked not to the house, but to the old wooden gate that opened onto the west pasture. The top hinge was loose. It had been for years. His father had always meant to fix it. He'd point it out every now and then. Gotta get to that hinge. But other, more pressing tasks always seemed to get in the way. Mark went to the workshop. It smelled of oil and sawdust and cold steel, the scent of his father. He found the right wrench, a handful of washers, and a can of grease. He walked back to the gate and set to work. He tightened the bolt, shimmed the hinge with a washer, and worked grease into the joint. He swung the gate open and closed. It moved smoothly now, without the familiar groan and sag. It was a small thing, a 10-minute job, but it felt important. He stood back and looked at the gate, then at the long sweep of the pasture that stretched toward the setting sun. Some things are planted for the next man.
His father had said that once, talking about a stand of walnut trees he'd planted that wouldn't mature in his lifetime. Mark finally understood what he meant. He had not just defended a piece of land, he had tended to a legacy. His mother came over from the garden, wiping her hands on her apron. "The gate," she said. "It's quiet now." Mark nodded. "Yes, it is." They stood together for a moment, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The debt was paid. The record was straight. The hinge was fixed. If this story of a quiet truth stayed with you, there will be more. Next time we travel to the high desert of Oregon to a small town library on the verge of being closed. We'll meet a woman named Sarah, a librarian in her final year before retirement. In a dusty archive room, she finds a surveyor's map from 1891. The county water board says it's just a piece of paper, a historical curiosity. But the river, which they plan to divert, tells a different story.
And Sarah, like David Vance, believes that some things, once put on paper, are meant to be permanent. We'll see what holds.